Mall manager kicks out Democrat man for wearing Harris-WALZ hat, unaware he is the new owner. The afternoon sun streamed through the towering glass windows of the upscale mall, casting sharp beams onto the pristine marble floors. The atrium buzzed with shoppers, their voices blending into a low hum punctuated by the clinking of coffee cups and the distant sound of children's laughter from the indoor playground. It was just another bustling day, until he walked in. The man wasn't flashy. He didn't stride in as though he owned the place. He wasn't cloaked in luxury or flaunting designer labels. He wore a simple tweed jacket, slightly frayed at the elbows, and a pair of dark slacks that were neat but understated. His most notable feature was the navy blue Harris-WALZ hat perched on his head. The bold red and white embroidery stood out like a beacon, impossible to miss. He adjusted his shopping bag, its handles cutting into his fingers, and wandered toward a kiosk selling overpriced candles. He barely glanced up, his face a mask of quiet thoughtfulness, as if lost in the moment. But one person did notice him, mall manager Duncan Healy. Duncan was stationed near the fountain, his broad shoulders wrapped in a too-tight blazer that pulled uncomfortably at the seams. His tie, a garish shade of orange, sat askew, but he didn't care. What he did care about was order, his definition of it. He prided himself on keeping the mall's image squeaky clean, ensuring it catered to the right kind of clientele, as he often liked to put it. And right now, his radar was locked onto the man in the Harris-WALZ hat. "That's trouble," Duncan muttered, narrowing his eyes as he sipped from his coffee. He had seen the news, heard the debates. Harris-WALZ had become a lightning rod in political discourse, a symbol of everything Duncan hated about those people. He couldn't stand the sight of it. He flagged down a young security guard standing nearby. "Ben," he barked, nodding toward the man. "Do you see what I see?" Ben, barely out of his teens, squinted in the direction Duncan was pointing. "What? The guy in the hat?" "Yes, the hat," Duncan hissed, as though the word carried venom. "We can't have that kind of thing here. It sends the wrong message." Ben blinked, confused. "The wrong message? It's not just anything." Duncan snapped, cutting him off. "It's political, it's divisive, and it's not what this mall stands for. Do you want customers complaining? Because I sure as hell don't." Ben hesitated, his brows furrowing. "I mean, he's not really doing anything." "That's the point," Duncan said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "They never do anything, until they do. That's how it starts. They come in here with their little symbols and their agendas, and before you know it, there's chaos." Ben stared at him, clearly skeptical, but Duncan was already marching toward the man, his coffee abandoned on a nearby bench. The man had moved on to a bookshop now, his hands idly flipping through the pages of a hardcover novel. He didn't seem to notice Duncan's approach, nor the growing tension in his body language. "Excuse me, sir," Duncan said, plastering on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Duncan Healy, the manager of this mall. I'd like to have a word." The man looked up, his expression mild, almost bemused. "Oh, what about?" Duncan gestured to the hat. "I couldn't help but notice your choice of headwear." The man raised an eyebrow. "Is there something wrong with it?" "Well," Duncan said, his tone saccharine with false politeness, "we try to keep this mall a neutral space, a place where people can shop without being confronted by, shall we say, divisive imagery." The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering Duncan's words. "Divisive imagery," he repeated. "You mean my hat?" "Precisely," Duncan said, his smile tightening. "It's not about the hat itself, you see. It's about the message it sends. Harris-WALZ is, well, let's just say it's a controversial brand." The man let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "You know what's funny?" he said, looking Duncan directly in the eye. "I didn't come here to send a message. I just came to shop, and I'm sure you did." Duncan replied quickly, though his tone betrayed his growing impatience. "But we have to think about how your attire might affect other customers. People might feel uncomfortable, threatened, even threatened by a hat," the man asked, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of disbelief. "That's quite a stretch." Duncan's smile faltered. He glanced over his shoulder, noticing a few shoppers starting to watch the interaction. He lowered his voice. Look, I'm just trying to keep the peace here. If you could just remove the hat while you're in the mall, we won't have any problems." The man folded his arms across his chest, his shopping bag dangling from one hand. "And if I don't?" Duncan's jaw tightened. "Then I'll have no choice but to ask you to leave." The man didn't move. His calm demeanor was unnerving, like he wasn't even slightly rattled by Duncan's thinly veiled threat. "You're serious?" he said, more as a statement than a question. "Completely," Duncan replied, crossing his own arms in an attempt to mirror the man's stance. "This is private property, and I have every right to enforce the rules." The man smirked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Interesting," he said, "because I don't recall seeing any rules posted about hats." "It's implied," Duncan snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "We don't need to spell out every little thing. Or maybe you just make it up as you go along." The man shot back, his voice still maddeningly calm. Duncan opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other, the tension between them thick enough to cut. The shoppers who had stopped to watch whispered among themselves, their curiosity growing by the second. Finally, Duncan straightened his tie, his face red with anger. "This is your last warning," he said, his voice low but trembling with fury. "Take off the hat, or leave." The man didn't move. Instead, he smiled, a small, knowing smile that only made Duncan's blood boil even more. The air between them felt charged, as though something much bigger was about to happen. The shoppers lingering nearby leaned in closer, their curiosity palpable. Duncan's face flushed a deeper shade of red as the man's smile lingered, calm and unbothered. It was a stark contrast to Duncan's barely contained rage, which simmered just beneath the surface. "Sir," Duncan said, lowering his voice slightly, but keeping his tone firm, "I'm trying to handle this politely, but you're not leaving me much of a choice. We have rules, and those rules apply to everyone." The man shifted his weight slightly, adjusting the shopping bag in his hand. "Interesting," he said, his voice still calm, but edged with something sharper now. "Because it seems like those rules only apply to certain people." Duncan stiffened. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man tilted his head, his expression mildly curious. "I mean, I've seen plenty of people walk through here wearing far more controversial things than a hat. Political shirts, slogans, you name it. Yet I'm the one getting stopped. Why is that exactly?" "That's not the point," Duncan snapped, the words leaving his mouth faster than he could think them through. "This isn't about what anyone else does. It's about maintaining the integrity of this mall." The man's smile widened slightly. "Integrity," he repeated, his tone almost mocking. "You're talking about integrity while trying to police a hat. That's rich." "It's not about the hat," Duncan shot back, his patience wearing thinner with every passing second. "It's about what the hat represents." "And what does it represent?" the man asked, leaning forward slightly. "Go ahead, enlighten me." Duncan hesitated, his mind scrambling for an answer. He could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze pressing down on him, their murmurs growing louder as the tension between him and the man thickened. "It represents division," he said finally, though the words felt flimsy even as he spoke them. "And we don't need that here." "Division," the man repeated, as though tasting the word. He took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Is that your assumption? Or is that your bias talking?" Duncan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "I don't have biases," he said defensively. "I have a responsibility to ensure this mall remains a welcoming place for everyone." The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Welcoming? That's an interesting choice of words, considering you're the one making me feel unwelcome." "Sir," Duncan said, his voice rising slightly, "I'm trying to give you the benefit of the doubt here. But you're not making this easy." "Neither are you," the man replied, his tone cutting. "You approached me. You're the one turning this into a spectacle." "I'm not turning this into anything," Duncan snapped, glancing around at the growing crowd. "You're the one refusing to cooperate." "Cooperate with what?" the man asked, raising an eyebrow. "Your arbitrary rules, your misplaced authority. You're asking me to do something that's not only unreasonable, but downright absurd." It's not unreasonable, Duncan barked, his frustration boiling over. It's about respect. Respect, the man repeated, his voice laced with incredulity. You don't get to demand respect while disrespecting me in the same breath. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Duncan's stomach sank. He could feel the tide turning against him, the energy of the onlookers shifting toward the man in the WALZ hat. His gaze darted to the security guard, Ben, who was standing nearby with a look of visible discomfort. Ben, Duncan barked, snapping his fingers. Escort him out. Ben hesitated, glancing at the man and then back at Duncan. I don't know if that's really necessary, he said cautiously. I mean, he's not actually doing anything wrong. Duncan's face darkened. I'm not asking for your opinion, Ben. I'm giving you an order. Ben swallowed hard but didn't move. The man in the hat turned toward him, his expression softening slightly. It's okay, he said, his tone quieter now. I'm not trying to get you in trouble. Ben's shoulders relaxed slightly, but Duncan wasn't having it. Don't listen to him, he snapped. He's trying to manipulate the situation. Manipulate, the man repeated, raising both eyebrows now. That's an interesting accusation coming from someone who's clearly losing control. I'm not losing control, Duncan shouted, his voice echoing through the atrium. The crowd let out a collective gasp, and Duncan realized too late that he'd raised his voice far louder than intended. The man tilted his head again, his gaze steady. You seem awfully defensive for someone who's in control, he said, his tone calm but cutting. Maybe you should take a step back and think about why you're really doing this. Duncan pointed a finger at him, his hand trembling slightly. Don't tell me how to do my job, he growled. You're not in a position to lecture me about anything. Clearly, the man said with a smirk, because if I were, this conversation would be over by now. The crowd chuckled, their laughter low but unmistakable. Duncan's face flushed with anger and humiliation. He could feel the situation slipping further and further out of his grasp, but he wasn't ready to give up. This is your last chance, he said, his voice low and menacing. Take off the hat, or leave. The man's smile faded slightly, replaced by an expression of mild amusement. You keep saying that, he said, his voice soft but firm. But we both know you don't have the power to make me do either. Duncan's chest heaved as he stared at the man, his mind racing. The crowd murmured louder now, their whispers and laughter feeding into the growing tension. Duncan's chest heaved, his fists clenched so tightly at his sides that his nails dug into his palms. The man's calm demeanor was infuriating, and the growing crowd only added to his frustration. Every chuckle, every whispered comment chipped away at the fragile facade of authority he was desperately clinging to. Listen, Duncan said, forcing a tight, strained smile as he straightened his blazer. I'm trying to be reasonable here. I don't want this to escalate any further than it already has. Then maybe you should stop escalating it, the man replied, his tone calm but pointed. His gaze didn't waver, and Duncan hated the way he seemed so unaffected by the entire ordeal. You approached me, remember? I was just minding my business, shopping like everyone else. You're not like everyone else, Duncan shot back, his voice rising despite himself. Not when you're walking around with that. He gestured furiously at the hat. On your head, making a statement. The man tilted his head, his brow furrowing slightly. And what statement do you think I'm making? You know exactly what I mean, Duncan snapped. No, I don't, the man replied, his voice still maddeningly composed. Why don't you spell it out for me? Duncan hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for the right words. The crowd watched intently, their whispers growing louder. He could feel their judgment, their amusement, and it only made his skin crawl. It's divisive, Duncan said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. It's provocative. People might feel uncomfortable. Uncomfortable how? The man asked, folding his arms. Because last I checked, wearing a hat isn't a crime. It's not about the hat itself, Duncan snapped, though he could hear how weak the argument sounded even as he said it. It's about what it represents. And what does it represent? The man pressed, his voice sharpening. Go ahead, Duncan. Say it. Duncan's face flushed, his frustration boiling over. You know what it represents, he said through gritted teeth. It's political, and this isn't the place for politics. Oh, so this mall is apolitical, the man asked, raising an eyebrow. Is that what you're trying to tell me? Exactly, Duncan said quickly, latching onto the word as though it were a lifeline. We're a neutral space, a place for families and shoppers, not a platform for personal agendas. The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. Neutral, he said almost to himself. That's funny, because what you're doing right now doesn't feel neutral at all. What's that supposed to mean? Duncan demanded, his voice rising again. It means you're singling me out, the man replied, his tone still calm, but carrying a sharper edge now. You're making a spectacle out of me. And for what? A hat. If you were really neutral, you wouldn't be doing this. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Duncan felt his chest tighten. He glanced at Ben, the young security guard, who was standing a few feet away with a conflicted expression on his face. Ben, Duncan barked, pointing at the man. Escort him out. Now. Ben hesitated, his gaze shifting between Duncan and the man. I don't think that's a good idea, he said quietly. He's not really doing anything wrong. Not doing anything wrong, Duncan repeated, his voice incredulous. He's disrupting the entire mall. Am I, though? The man interjected, his voice cutting through Duncan's tirade. Because from where I'm standing, you're the only one raising your voice. The crowd chuckled again, and Duncan's face burned with humiliation. Don't turn this around on me, he growled, pointing a finger at the man. You're the one who's causing a scene. I'm causing a scene, the man asked, his eyebrows rising. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call security. I didn't try to kick someone out for wearing a hat. That was all you. The crowd murmured louder, their whispers and chuckles blending into a low roar. Duncan could feel their eyes on him, their judgment pressing down like a physical weight. He turned back to Ben, his voice trembling with frustration. Ben, he said, his tone pleading now. Please, just do your job. Ben looked at the man, then at Duncan, then at the crowd. Finally, he sighed and took a hesitant step forward. Sir, he said, addressing the man in the hat, maybe we could move this conversation somewhere more private. The man shook his head. I'm not going anywhere, he said firmly. I haven't done anything wrong. If your boss here wants me gone, he can explain why in front of everyone. Ben glanced back at Duncan, who was visibly shaking with anger. He's not leaving, Ben said softly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. Then I'll handle it myself, Duncan snapped, pushing past Ben and stepping directly in front of the man. This is your last chance, he said, his voice low and menacing. Take off the hat, or leave. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled a small, knowing smile that made Duncan's blood boil. You keep saying that, he said quietly, but we both know you don't have the authority to make me do either. Duncan's chest heaved as he stared at the man, his mind racing. The crowd was silent now, their attention laser-focused on the standoff. The tension between the two men crackled in the air like a live wire, threatening to snap at any moment. And still, the man didn't move. The crowd's silence was deafening. Duncan felt their collective gaze burning into him, their judgment amplifying every second he stood there, unable to assert control. His breath quickened as he pointed a trembling finger at the man. You're pushing your luck, he hissed, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. This is my mall, and I don't tolerate disrespect. Disrespect, the man replied, his tone still maddeningly calm. He tilted his head slightly, as if genuinely curious. You think I'm disrespecting you because I won't roll over and obey your arbitrary rules? It's not arbitrary, Duncan snapped. I'm trying to protect this mall's reputation. The man raised an eyebrow. And what reputation is that exactly? One where people are harassed for wearing hats. Duncan's jaw tightened. Don't twist this around, he growled. You're the one causing a scene. I'm causing a scene, the man asked, gesturing toward the crowd. Look around, Duncan. The only person shouting here is you. The crowd murmured in agreement, their whispers growing louder. Someone in the back chuckled audibly, and Duncan whipped around to glare at them. This isn't a joke, he barked, his voice echoing across the atrium. Go back to your shopping, all of you. But the crowd didn't move. If anything, more people were gathering, their phones held high, recording every second of the confrontation. Duncan's stomach churned at the thought of this going viral, but he couldn't back down now, not with so many eyes on him. This is your last warning, he said, turning back to the man. If you don't leave, I'll have no choice but to call the police. The man shrugged, completely unfazed. Go ahead, he said. Call them. I'll wait. Duncan hesitated, his hand hovering over his phone. The man's confidence was unnerving, and for the first time, doubt crept into Duncan's mind. What if the police didn't take his side? What if this whole thing backfired spectacularly? You don't think I'll do it? Duncan said, his voice rising again to mask his uncertainty. I've dealt with plenty of people like you before. You think you're above the rules, but you're not. The man smirked. People like me, he repeated, his voice laced with amusement. Careful, Duncan. You're starting to sound awfully biased. I'm not biased. Duncan snapped, the words spilling out before he could stop them. I'm enforcing the rules, the same as I would with anyone else. Is that so? The man asked, folding his arms. Because I've been watching people walk through this mall all day wearing all kinds of things. Sports jerseys, political shirts, even some pretty offensive slogans. Yet none of them got stopped. Just me. That's different, Duncan said quickly, though even he wasn't sure why. They weren't stirring up trouble. The man let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. Trouble, he repeated. You keep using that word like it applies to me. But I'm not the one yelling at strangers in the middle of a mall. The crowd chuckled again, and Duncan's face flushed. He turned to the security guard, Ben, who was still standing nearby, with an increasingly uncomfortable expression. Ben, he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Remove him. Now. Ben hesitated, his eyes darting between Duncan and the man. I don't think that's a good idea, he said cautiously. He's not actually breaking any rules. Duncan's face turned an even deeper shade of red. You're a security guard, he snapped. Your job is to enforce my orders, not question them. I'm also supposed to de-escalate situations, Ben said, his voice firming slightly. And this isn't de-escalating. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Duncan felt his chest tighten. His gaze shifted to the older security guard, a grizzled man named Rich, who had just arrived on the scene. Rich, Duncan said, his tone pleading now. Help me out here. Rich surveyed the situation with a critical eye, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't look impressed. What exactly do you want me to do, Duncan? He asked finally. Kick out a paying customer for wearing a hat. Yes, Duncan exclaimed, throwing his hands in the air. That's exactly what I want you to do. Rich shook his head, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. You're on your own with this one, he said. I'm not about to get dragged into whatever mess you've created here. Duncan's mouth fell open, and for a moment, he was completely speechless. He turned back to the man, his hands balled into fists at his sides. You're making a fool out of me, he growled, his voice low and trembling with rage. No, Duncan, the man said, his tone calm but unyielding. You're doing that all by yourself. The crowd erupted into laughter, their voices blending into a roar that made Duncan's ears ring. He spun around, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. Stop filming, he shouted, his voice cracking. All of you, put your phones away. But no one listened. If anything, more phones went up, their cameras trained on Duncan as he stood there, visibly shaking with anger. He turned back to the man, his breathing ragged. This isn't over, he said through gritted teeth. The man raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening slightly. You're right, he said. It's not. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Duncan knew he had lost whatever control he thought he had. But he wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Duncan's face burned so hot it felt like it might ignite. The laughter from the crowd grew louder, blending with the low hum of whispered commentary. The sound was deafening to him, a taunting chorus that only fueled his rage. He clenched his fists so tightly his nails bit into his palms, his thoughts spinning out of control. This was supposed to be simple. He'd handle the situation, assert his authority, and move on. But now he was being humiliated, and the man in the Harris walls hadn't even broken a sweat. "All right," Duncan said, his voice trembling but louder than before. "If no one here is willing to do their job, I'll just have to take care of this myself." The man tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Take care of it how, exactly?" he asked, his voice dripping with calm curiosity. "Don't test me," Duncan snarled, pointing a trembling finger at him. "I've dealt with people like you before. You think you're untouchable, but you're not." "Oh, Duncan," the man said, letting out a soft chuckle. "You're not still trying to sound intimidating, are you? Because it's not working." The crowd laughed again, louder this time, their voices ringing out like a victory bell. Someone shouted, "He's making a fool of himself," and others cheered in agreement. Duncan whipped around, his face contorted with rage. "Who said that?" he barked, his voice echoing across the atrium. "Step forward if you've got something to say." No one moved, but the laughter continued, rippling through the crowd like waves. Duncan's chest heaved as he turned back to the man in the hat, his body trembling with a mix of fury and humiliation. "You want to make this a spectacle?" Duncan growled, stepping closer to the man. "Fine, let's make it a spectacle." The man raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and how do you plan to do that?" Without warning, Duncan lunged forward and snatched the hat off the man's head, holding it aloft like a trophy. "There," he shouted, his voice cracking with triumph. "Now you don't have a hat, do you?" The crowd gasped, their murmurs turning into shocked exclamations. Phones shot higher into the air, their cameras capturing every second of the unfolding chaos. The man, however, didn't flinch. He simply stared at Duncan, his expression calm but tinged with disbelief. "You really just did that," the man said softly, shaking his head. "You've officially lost it. I'm enforcing the rules." Duncan shouted, waving the hat in the air. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "Duncan!" A voice interrupted, sharp and commanding. Duncan froze, his arms still raised, the hat clutched tightly in his fist. He turned slowly, his eyes landing on a woman in a tailored red blazer and a crisp white blouse. Her name tag read Victoria, regional manager, and her expression was a mix of disbelief and barely contained fury. "What the hell is going on here?" Victoria demanded, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. The crowd immediately quieted, their attention shifting to the newcomer. "Victoria," Duncan said, his voice suddenly an octave higher. He dropped the hat, his hands flying to his sides as he tried to compose himself. I was just handling a situation." Victoria's gaze flicked to the man in the Harris walls hat, who bent down to pick it up with deliberate slowness. He dusted it off, placed it back on his head, and looked up at her with a small, knowing smile. "Handling a situation," Victoria repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. She turned back to Duncan. "From where I'm standing, it looks like you're harassing a customer." No, it's not like that," Duncan stammered, his hands gesturing wildly. He was being disruptive. He was wearing that." He pointed at the hat, his fingers shaking. Victoria crossed her arms, her gaze hardening. "And you think that justifies ripping it off his head, in front of an entire crowd of customers, while they're filming?" Duncan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The crowd murmured again, their whispers punctuated by the occasional laugh. Victoria sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose as if trying to stave off a headache. "This is unacceptable," she said finally, her voice firm. "Duncan, you've crossed a line." "Victoria, please," Duncan said, his voice cracking. "You don't understand. This man is trying to undermine the integrity of them all." The man let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "Integrity," he repeated. "You keep using that word like it means something." "Quiet," Duncan snapped, his face twisting with rage. "You don't get to say anything. You're the one who started this." "That's enough," Victoria barked, her voice cutting through the noise like a whip. The crowd immediately fell silent, and even Duncan took a step back, his eyes wide. Victoria turned to the man, her expression softening slightly. "Sir, I'm sorry for whatever this is," she said, gesturing vaguely toward Duncan. "If there's anything I can do to make this right, please let me know." The man tilted his head, his gaze steady. "I think you've done enough," he said, his voice calm but laced with something unspoken. Victoria hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to decipher his meaning. The tension in the air was almost suffocating, the crowd holding their breath as they waited for what would happen next. And then the man smiled, a small, knowing smile that made Duncan's stomach churn. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by everyone, "there's one thing you can do." Victoria straightened, her expression guarded. "And what's that?" The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black card. He held it up, the bold WALZ Properties logo catching the light. "Let him know who he just tried to kick out." The crowd erupted into gasps and murmurs, their phones capturing every second of the revelation. Duncan's face went pale, his mouth falling open as the realization hit him, like a freight train. The crowd surged with a collective gasp, their murmurs escalating into a cacophony of shock and disbelief. The sleek black card gleamed in the man's hand, its bold WALZ Properties logo practically glowing under the atrium lights. Phones zoomed in, cameras capturing every detail, every stunned expression. Duncan stood frozen, his arms hanging limply at his sides. His mouth opened, then closed, but no sound came out. His brain was screaming at him to do something, anything, but his body refused to cooperate. He felt as though the ground had been yanked out from under him, leaving him to flail helplessly in midair. "You've got to be kidding me," someone in the crowd muttered. Another voice said louder, "Oh, this is going to be good." The man in the WALZ had turned to Victoria, his expression calm but deadly serious. "I trust you know what this card means," he said, his voice carrying across the atrium like a gavel hitting a judge's bench. Victoria's face paled. She took a step back, her professional demeanor cracking for the first time. You're the new owner," she stammered, the words barely audible. "That's right," the man said, his gaze shifting to Duncan. "I own this mall. Every store, every corner, every tile on this floor mine." The crowd erupted into whispers and exclamations, their energy feeding into the tension like gasoline on a fire. Duncan blinked rapidly, his mind scrambling for a way out of the nightmare he'd just walked into. This is some kind of joke," he said weakly, though his voice was trembling. You're lying." The man raised an eyebrow, his smirk returning. "Oh, Duncan," he said, his tone dripping with mock pity. "You really should read the corporate memos. They announced the change in ownership weeks ago." Duncan's knees buckled slightly, but he caught himself on the edge of a nearby kiosk. His mind raced, trying to piece together an explanation, a defense, something to salvage his shattered authority. "I didn't know," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I didn't know." "No, you didn't," the man said, stepping closer. His voice dropped, each word cutting through the air like a blade. "But you should have. And even if you didn't know who I was, you had no right to treat anyone the way you treated me." Duncan's mouth opened to protest, but the man raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "Don't bother," he said sharply. "I've heard enough of your excuses." The crowd cheered, their voices a wave of vindication that crashed over Duncan like a tidal wave. He looked around, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for even a sliver of sympathy. But there was none. The crowd wasn't on his side. They were relishing every second of his downfall. The man turned to Victoria, his expression softening slightly. "Victoria," he said, "I want you to take note of this. Effective immediately. Duncan Healy is no longer employed by WALZ Properties." Victoria's eyes widened, but she quickly regained her composure. "Of course," she said, pulling out her phone to make a note. "Wait!" Duncan exclaimed, his voice cracking as he stepped forward. "You can't do this. I've been here for years. I've built this place. And in all those years," the man said, his voice icy, "you've clearly learned nothing about respect, about fairness, or about leadership. This mall deserves better. And so do the people who work and shop here. The crowd roared in approval, their cheers echoing through the atrium. Duncan's face turned an even deeper shade of red, his humiliation complete. "Please," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You don't understand. I was just trying to..." "To what?" The man interrupted, his voice sharp. "Assert your authority. Flex your power. Harass a customer because you didn't like their hat." He shook his head. "You weren't trying to protect the small, Duncan. You were trying to protect your ego." Duncan staggered back, his legs shaking as the weight of the man's words pressed down on him. The crowd jeered, their voices growing louder with every passing second. Someone shouted, "Pack your bags, Duncan." And another yelled, "Don't let the door hit you on the way out." I... Duncan stammered, his voice breaking. "I made a mistake, okay? I'll do better, I swear." The man raised an eyebrow. "Do better," he repeated, his voice cold. "It's a little late for that, don't you think?" Duncan's shoulders sagged, his head hanging low. For the first time, he looked truly defeated. The man turned to Victoria again, his tone decisive. "Make sure he's escorted out immediately," he said. "I don't want him causing any more trouble." Victoria nodded, motioning to Rich and Ben. The two security guards stepped forward, flanking Duncan on either side. "Let's go," Rich said, his voice firm but not unkind. Duncan hesitated, his eyes darting back to the man one last time. "Please," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "Don't do this." But the man didn't respond. He simply turned away, signaling the end of the conversation. The crowd parted as Duncan was led away, their jeers and laughter following him like a scarlet letter. As the man adjusted his WALZ hat and turned to the remaining crowd, his expression softened slightly. "Thank you all for your patience," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "I promise you, this mall is in good hands now." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers a final nail in Duncan's coffin. The man smiled, tipping his hat slightly before walking away, leaving behind an atrium filled with whispers, laughter, and the lingering echoes of justice served. As Duncan was escorted out of the atrium, the crowd followed his every step, their phones capturing his disgrace from every angle. He shuffled between Rich and Ben, his head down, his shoulders hunched. The bright lights of the mall, once a symbol of his domain, now felt like an interrogation spotlight, exposing every crack in his facade. His ears burned as the voices behind him grew louder. "Guess he's not the boss anymore. Wonder if he'll apply for a job at the food court." The laughter that followed was like a hammer blow to his pride. Duncan gritted his teeth, his mind racing for a way to salvage what little dignity he had left. But the man in the WALZ hat wasn't done with him. "Wait," the man called out, his voice ringing through the atrium. Duncan stopped dead in his tracks, his stomach lurching. He turned slowly, his face pale as he looked back at the man, who was now walking toward him with calm, deliberate steps. The crowd fell silent, their anticipation palpable. Even Victoria, who had been busy directing the situation, paused to watch. "I just realized," the man said, his voice smooth and sharp, "that I almost let you walk out of here without addressing one more thing." Duncan's throat tightened. What thing?" The man reached into his pocket again, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, letting the suspense build, before holding it up for the crowd to see. It was a printed memo on official WALZ Properties letterhead. "This," the man said, his tone carrying the weight of a hammer about to drop, "is an internal report I received just last week. It's a summary of employee feedback about the management at this mall." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Care to guess whose name came up more than anyone else?" The crowd murmured, their whispers like a wave crashing against Duncan's fragile composure. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Let me read you an excerpt," the man continued, unfolding the paper further. He scanned the document, then cleared his throat dramatically. "The manager regularly belittles employees, refuses to listen to suggestions, and creates a hostile work environment." He glanced up, his eyes locking onto Duncan's. "Sound familiar?" Duncan's face turned a sickly shade of gray. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, there's more, the man said, his smirk widening. He turned back to the paper. Employees feel undervalued and disrespected, with several citing specific instances of public humiliation at the hands of the manager. He looked up again, his gaze piercing. Any of this ringing a bell? The crowd gasped, their murmurs escalating into full-blown exclamations. Duncan's legs felt like they might give out beneath him. This is out of context, he stammered. It's not what it sounds like. Oh, but it is, the man said, folding the paper and tucking it back into his pocket. I've already reviewed the security footage, the employee complaints, and the customer surveys. The pattern is clear. You've been running this mall like your own personal fiefdom, and it ends today. The crowd erupted into cheers, their applause echoing through the atrium. Someone shouted, "Good riddance," and another voice added, "Justice at last." Duncan's head spun, the noise pressing in from all sides. He felt like he was drowning in the humiliation. The man stepped closer, his voice lowering so only Duncan could hear him. "You didn't just mess up today," he said. "This is the culmination of years of bad behavior. You've been a bully, Duncan, and now you're facing the consequences." Duncan's eyes darted around the atrium, looking for an escape, but there was none. Rich and Ben stood on either side of him, their postures firm. The crowd loomed like a wall, their judgment written on every face. And the man in the WALZ hat, his new boss, stood in front of him, a symbol of everything Duncan had tried and failed to control. "I suggest you take this as a learning experience," the man said, his voice calm but unforgiving. "Because I can assure you, no one will hire you in a leadership position again once they see the videos from today." Duncan's stomach twisted into knots. "Videos?" The man raised an eyebrow, gesturing to the sea of phones still trained on them. "Oh, you didn't notice?" he asked, his tone dripping with mock surprise. "This entire fiasco is already trending. I think the hashtag is #DuncanMeltdown, but I'm sure there will be a few variations." The crowd burst into laughter, the sound sharp and cutting. Duncan's face burned as he realized the full extent of the situation. Not only had he been fired in front of an audience, but his humiliation was now immortalized online for the world to see. "And one more thing," the man said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear now. "The next time you feel the need to assert your authority, maybe think twice about who you're dealing with. You never know when the customer might be your boss." The crowd cheered again, their applause deafening. Duncan's shoulders slumped as Rich and Ben led him toward the exit. He didn't look back, he couldn't. The weight of his disgrace was too heavy, crushing him under its relentless pressure. As the glass doors closed behind him, the man turned back to the crowd, adjusting his hat with a satisfied smile. "All right, folks," he said, his tone light and commanding. "Show's over. Let's get back to shopping." The crowd dispersed slowly, their chatter filled with excitement and satisfaction. Phones buzzed with notifications as people uploaded their footage. The hashtag #DuncanMeltdown already trending on every platform. And as the man in the WALZ had walked away, he couldn't help but smile. Justice had been served. Outside the mall, Duncan stumbled into the biting wind of the parking lot, flanked by Rich and Ben. The glass doors slid shut behind him with a hiss, cutting off the cheers and chatter of the crowd inside. But the sound still echoed in his mind, a relentless reminder of his humiliation. He stopped near the curb, his legs shaky, and turned to face the two security guards. "You don't have to do this," he said weakly, his voice cracking. "You know me. You've worked with me for years." Rich crossed his arms, his expression unmoved. "Yeah, Duncan, we do know you. That's why this is happening." Duncan's mouth opened, but no words came out. He turned to Ben, searching for a shred of sympathy in the younger man's face. But Ben avoided his gaze, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. "Just go home, Duncan," Rich said, his tone firm but devoid of malice. "The longer you stay here, the worse it's going to get." Duncan glanced around the parking lot, his heart sinking further. Several shoppers had followed him outside, their phones still raised. Some laughed, others whispered, but all of them were watching, waiting for one final moment to capture. His hands trembled as he fumbled with his coat, pulling it tighter around himself. The wind cut through him like a blade, but it was nothing compared to the icy shame coursing through his veins. "I gave my life to this mall," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I built this place." "Maybe that's the problem," Rich said, his voice steady. "You treated it like it was yours, like the people who worked here didn't matter. You didn't build this mall, Duncan. You just worked here." Duncan's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "And you think you're better than me?" He spat, his voice rising. "You think you're not replaceable? Because you are. All of you are." Rich didn't flinch. "That might be true," he said calmly. "But at least I know how to treat people with respect." Duncan's face twisted with rage. But before he could respond, Ben stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "He's right, Duncan. You've been like this for years. Picking on people, belittling them, acting like you're untouchable. It was only a matter of time before it caught up with you." Duncan stared at him, his chest heaving. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders slumped. He turned away, his gaze falling on his beat-up sedan parked a few rows away. The paint was chipped, the tires worn, and the driver's side mirror hung at an awkward angle, barely attached. It looked as defeated as he felt. Without another word, he trudged toward the car, his steps heavy and uneven. The sound of laughter followed him, sharp and unforgiving, and he clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. He reached the car and yanked the door handle, but it stuck. He pulled again, harder this time, and the door finally creaked open with a groan of protest. As he slid into the driver's seat, he caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, his hair disheveled. He barely recognized himself. With a shaking hand, he turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, then died. He tried again, but the result was the same. "Perfect," he muttered, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. "Just perfect." He rested his forehead against the wheel, his breath fogging up the cracked windshield. The laughter from the parking lot was muffled now, but it still lingered in the air, a constant reminder of his failure. He wanted to scream, to cry, to do something, anything, to release the pressure building inside him. But he couldn't. He was trapped in his own misery, drowning in it. Meanwhile, back inside the mall, the man in the WALZ hat stood in the center of the atrium, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. The energy in the room was electric, a mix of vindication and curiosity. He adjusted his hat, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips, and stepped forward. "Thank you all for your patience," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "I know this has been a bit of an unusual day." The crowd chuckled, their laughter warm and genuine this time. A few people clapped, and someone shouted, "You're a legend." The man's smile widened slightly, but he raised a hand to quiet them. "This mall is more than just a place to shop," he continued. "It's a community, a place where people come to connect, to unwind, and to feel welcome. And I promise you, as the new owner, I will do everything in my power to make sure it stays that way." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the atrium. Victoria, standing off to the side, nodded in approval. She stepped forward as the man turned to her, her expression professional but tinged with relief. "Thank you for stepping in," she said quietly. "That could have gone much worse." The man chuckled softly. "It already went worse," he said, "but at least it's over now." Victoria hesitated, then glanced toward the glass doors, where Duncan had disappeared. "Do you think he'll try to come back?" The man shook his head. "He won't," he said simply. "And if he does, we'll deal with it." Victoria nodded, her posture relaxing slightly. "What's next then?" she asked. "Do you want to hold a meeting with the staff? Address the changes?" "Not yet," the man said, adjusting his hat again. "Let's give them some time to process. Today's been a lot." Victoria smiled faintly. "Understood." As the crowd began to disperse, the man turned back toward the atrium, his gaze lingering on the fountain in the center. He took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over him. This wasn't just about firing Duncan or reclaiming the mall's integrity. It was about setting a new tone, a new standard, and he was ready for it. Outside, Duncan sat in his car, the engine finally sputtering to life. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, and stared straight ahead. The mall loomed in his rearview mirror, its bright lights a cruel reminder of everything he'd lost. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he caught sight of a group of teenagers pointing at his car and laughing. One of them held up their phone, the screen flashing with what could only be a video of his earlier meltdown. Duncan's chest tightened, but he didn't stop. He kept driving, the sound of their laughter fading into the distance. Days later, the viral video of Duncan's meltdown had amassed millions of views, trending across platforms. Meanwhile, the new owner of the mall quietly implemented sweeping changes: better pay for staff, clearer policies, and a focus on fostering a welcoming community. Duncan, now unemployed and drowning in online ridicule, disappeared from public view. The mall thrived under its new leadership, becoming a hub for positivity and inclusion. Shoppers and employees alike buzzed with excitement, grateful for the fresh start. Justice had been served, and the community finally felt like it was in the right hands. And so, the mall flourished, leaving a lesson: respect matters, and karma always finds its way.